Hello and welcome to WION World is One. I'm Kanishka Sarkar. Well, the proposed Sanctioning Russia Act of 2026 could allow the United States to impose tariffs of up to 100% on countries that continue to buy oil, Russian crude that is, and with India among the biggest countries in focus. What could this mean for India's exports, fuel prices, energy security, and foreign policy? And also, can India balance its ties with both Washington and Moscow while protecting its economic interests? To discuss all of this, I'm joined by Jayant Krishna, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Krishna, hi, thank you so much for joining me on Beyond today. This bill, sure, it's a relief when compared with the previously proposed 500% tariff, but 100% itself is still very high. Which Indian sectors do you think could be hit the hardest if this goes through?
See, one thing is very clear, as you said, 100% is too high, and no worthwhile exports can happen at 100% tariff, right? So I think the sector, most vulnerable is energy itself. If you look at, if there's a complete sanction against, buying Russian crude oil. See, today, our dependence on Russian crude oil reduced after the penalty was imposed. But over the years, over a period of time, as the Gulf War came into being, and the global the oil supply became more and more vulnerable. If you look at, almost 40% of India's overall crude oil came from Russia in May, and June data was slightly in excess of 50% of India's overall oil. So that's one sector which will be impacted very, very badly if the bill sees the light of the day. Which is likely because it's a bipartisan bill. Both the parties are supporting it, and and the general belief is that the money used, the oil money that Russia gets from India, it's used to fund the Ukraine war. And now suddenly there are a lot of sentiments. When Lindsey Graham had introduced the bill, after he recently died, right? So that's also very important. So I think the people want to, from across the parties, they want to pay tributes to him, and suddenly there's a lot of sympathy for this bill. So I think the other sector is defense. I think that's very, very important because, a substantive part of our defense imports come from Russia, and the sanctions also cover the defense and aerospace capabilities and production of Russia. So that's one. And third area which is likely to be impacted is the banking and financial services. Because this sanction would include, would adversely affect the payment systems also. So I think these three sectors, to my mind, are the ones which will be impacted a lot more by the bill. And if 100% tariff comes into being, it will adversely impact almost everything that India exports to the US right now. Nothing will be away. From pharmaceutical to auto components to footwear and leather goods to apparel. I think every sector would get impacted if 100% of tariff comes into being.
Got it. Mr. Krishna, like you highlighted, of course, a lot of external factors are at play, and defense, PFSI, and energy, of course, could be the hardest hit sectors. Of course, the impact is going to follow on others as well, but these could be the three hardest hit ones. But at this point in time, given the current scenario in play, can India really reduce Russian oil imports without hurting its own economy or fuel prices?
See, if you look at the history of Russian crude oil supply to India, right? Earlier in this financial year, India was importing huge amount before the sanction came into being. Largely because the pricing at which India was able to buy Russian crude oil was very low, perhaps the lowest among the basket of countries. That India imports its crude oil from Russia, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, US, So I think Russian oil was the cheapest, which is not the case after the West Asia war came into being. And the prices have surged because of the overall global oil prices. So I think, India will have to reduce this and look at, other sources more seriously. Because while Russia has been a very, very trusted ally of India from a very, very long time, from the Cold War days to after 1981 bilateral relationship started and so on and so forth. after the disintegration of erstwhile USSR. So I think has been a very important partner, strategic partner for India and a trusted partner. But I think given the international pressure and especially from the US, India will have to reduce the dependence on Russian crude oil. And now it will not be all that difficult because we are no longer getting that crude oil at the lowest possible price, which used to be the case earlier. Yet India started buying more from Russia during the West Asia crisis,
Yeah.
largely because other supplies had either died
Right.
down or had become vulnerable and more suspect. That was the reason.
Yeah, and you rightly pointed out that Russia is a strategic partner of India. But let's talk about the other party as well. What do you think US might expect from India in return for a tariff waiver, if at all?
So, if you shift the discussion completely on the tariff issue, are you sort of talking about tariff waiver from 500 to 100? Is that what your question is? Can you repeat that?
I'm asking, what might the US expect from India in return for tariff waivers? Right now, 100% is being proposed, but if a waiver were to happen, what do you think the US is going to expect in return?
See, negotiations, are always give and take, right? I mean, in today's day and age, countries do not necessarily get what they deserve. They get what they negotiate, right? So I think that give and take will completely, will keep on happening. I think the biggest thing that US, I think, would be asking India is access to its markets, especially for some of its food, and agro item exports from US to India, because India is a huge market, the world's most populous country, and US for long has been demanding access to Indian markets, especially for products like soya, corn,
Yeah.
cheese, and so on and so forth. So I think that would be a huge big area for US, will try to barter. And for once the bill is passed and it authorizes Trump to have up to 100% tariff, which is not practical, obviously. And it will never become 100 to my mind. It will be lower, but that is what US would expect, its pound of flesh for a lower tariff. That's my understanding. Yeah.
Right, so the agriculture sector could once again come to the focus. Now, how do you think these sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet disrupt India's oil supplies?
So yes, see, today it will surely disrupt India's oil supply, because the Strait of Hormuz, issues are still not over. We thought that the problem has become something of the past, but again, there are renewed hostilities there and attacks and so on and so forth, and the seamless flow of traffic on through the Hormuz Strait has not. Has again been adversely affected. So I think it will definitely affect, and and there are limited number of countries India can go to. Today the major countries from where we buy crude oil are, as I said earlier, Russia, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, UAE, US. I think some of the areas which could be looked at is, of course, it's controversial. It's Iran. Can we get more from there, and Venezuela, which is also largely controlled by the US today. I think these are the two areas where more supplies can come once our dependence on Russian crude oil goes down, and little more because our ties with Saudi Arabia and UAE have historically been very good, and especially with this government, our relationship has improved substantially. So I think the amount we get from there, I think would also, as a proportion, would go up. That's my feeling once this huge dependence on Russian crude oil reduces, which from 1/3 of our requirement went to 40% to last month it crossed 50%. So I think that is how I think the delicate equilibrium will eventually settle, to my mind.
Right. Mr. Krishna, so that's all about alternatives where India could buy oil from. But there's also one key question here. How does this test India's policy of balancing ties with both the US and Russia?
So this is it's a tightrope walk, right? US is a strategic partner and a very important country, perhaps the most important country worldwide. US is the country from which India gets the highest amount of FDI, and not just 1 or 2 years or a long period of time. It is the biggest investor in our country. If you look at the US continues to be the innovation and science and technology capital of the world. So that is our dependence on technology also is largely there. And also from a trade perspective, US is India's second largest partner after China, right? So I think that dependence would continue, and my feeling is, while Russia historically has been a very, very important partner for India, and especially in defense area. See what happens, oil, energy area. If we slow down from there, the world doesn't come to a grinding halt for India, right? There are other sources which India can bank upon, right? But I think, given the kind of Russian defense equipment that we have as an installation base in the country, I think their spare parts, the servicing and updates and so on and so forth, that's very important, and India will have to look at that. If you look at lots of defense products like the naval, the naval frigates, the twin engine helicopters, the BrahMos, missiles, Sukhoi, INS Vikramaditya. There are a lot of areas where there's a huge amount of dependence on Russia.
Yeah.
And if memory doesn't fail me, till about 10 years back, we used to import the overall defense import of India. Almost two-thirds of that used to come from Russia itself. So I think this is a balancing act. No easy solutions at all.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to get closer to US in today's day and age. That's the reality. But you can't ignore Russia altogether, even though we may reduce our dependence on the Russian oil. But defense is too important an area for us to completely lose sight of. And see, Russia and India, if you look at US and India, if you look at purely from a trade perspective, US. India has a trade surplus in its favor, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at the Russia, last year the total India's imports from Russia were about $69 billion, out of which $57 billion was oil itself, right? So there are lots of areas where India can start exporting to Russia, especially footwear, pharma, chemicals, auto components. I think the apparels. So I think these are the areas where there's a lot of opportunities for us, and therefore this tightrope walk and the balancing act would have to continue. There are no magical answers, but I think that is what international diplomacy is all about.
Right, so that tightrope walk will have to continue. And lastly, Mr. Krishna, could this push India closer to China on energy in any way, or do you think it's going to chart its own course?
That's a good question. I think China. I think not as much for crude oil, but I think for non-conventional sources. Both the countries have faced. If you look at this, if this bill comes into being, the biggest sufferers would be China and India, right? So these vulnerabilities on fossil fuel area and the shocks therein have troubled both the countries. I think the areas where India could gravitate closer to China in the energy sector is not the crude oil, but other areas like the power equipment and infrastructure, which is for electricity transmission, distribution, and even generation. I think that's one area where India has a lot to learn and get from China, looking at the advances which have happened in the electricity generation and transmission and distribution technologies in China. Second is the solar manufacturing. Even today, much of the solar manufacturing that happens in India, the supply chains are integrated with China, and the technology is from China. So I think that's another area where we'll get perhaps closer. Electric vehicles and also the battery manufacturing is one area where India has a lot to gain from China. And hydrogen development. I think these are the four areas which are all in the non-conventional space, except electricity, last three being in non-conventional space. I think where, I have always been advocating a closer relationship between India and China, not only in the power sector, energy sector, but all across. And I believe India will have no alternative but to get closer to China on in the areas I just talked about.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Krishna, with all of those insights. We'll keep tracking this story as it unfolds and getting insights from you. Thank you so much for joining me on WION today.
My pleasure, Kanishka.
All right. Well, clearly, this bill is about much more than just oil. It could reshape trade, diplomacy, and India's strategic choices in the years ahead. And energy and defense are going to be the key sectors to track. We'll continue tracking the story and bring you updates as they unfold. Thank you for watching.